Hi, my name is Sandy Schaefer, and I'm an instructor with the Educational Services team in Washington, D.C. Joining me today is Malcolm, a product specialist for job tracking with ArcGIS. We would like to welcome you all to today's live training seminar, An Introduction to Job Tracking for ArcGIS. In today's seminar, we will be discussing job tracking. We will start by defining job tracking. Then we will talk about how you can use JTX to track and manage jobs in your organization. Finally, we will talk about how to set up a workflow for a specific type of job. Throughout the presentation, we will be discussing how to use job tracking for ArcGIS. We will conduct software demonstrations, and we will have a review period followed by question and answer sessions, during which time Malcolm will answer some of your questions. So let's begin with answering the question, what is job tracking? In a GIS environment, job tracking is the process of monitoring and documenting work that is being completed. You, as the manager of a GIS project, might be interested in knowing when a job was started, who has been involved with doing the work, and what tasks thus far have been completed. Now, the tasks we are talking about can be just about anything: data production, map creation, or even data analysis. There are challenges associated with tracking and monitoring GIS jobs. The desire is to be able to monitor the time spent on projects without the monitoring process interfering with the work being done. A true job tracking system should mostly operate behind the scenes, gathering the needed information automatically, while allowing for user interaction when needed. A few years ago, ESRI began offering a solution to the traditional challenges of job tracking. It's called Job Tracking for ArcGIS, also known as JTX. Well, what is JTX, you ask? It is a system that is integrated into ArcGIS to help you track and manage the work being performed in your organization. Its integration into ArcGIS makes it a solution to the past challenges of job tracking. It performs many operations behind the scenes, gathering information such as date and timestamps, so that the end user doesn't have to. It also has an interface that acts as a center point for the work being done and the information that is being shared. The actual product definition that you will see for JTX is that it is an enterprise GIS workflow management system. I want to take a minute to break down that definition. Enterprise refers to something that is organization-wide, where you will potentially have multiple people accessing and using the same data. Workflow means that you can use JTX to establish processes or tasks that need to be done. And management refers to the ability to document progress and information about the work being completed. So what do you need to use JTX? First off, you need to have either an ArcEditor or ArcInfo license level of ArcGIS Desktop. Because it's an enterprise system, you need to also have ArcSDE, the spatial data extension for ArcGIS. One of the requirements for ArcSDE is that you have a relational database management system, an RDBMS. This means that you are storing your data in either Oracle, SQL Server, Informix, or DB2. The last piece of the puzzle is JTX, an extension to ArcGIS. I should mention that as a manager, you don't need to know everything there is to know about SDE and your RDBMS to use JTX. Now, you do need to have someone on your staff that can manage and maintain SDE and your database, but to actually use JTX, project managers really only need to have a working knowledge of the concepts of data management with SDE. Thus far, we've talked about what job tracking is, and I've introduced you to our featured product, Job Tracking for ArcGIS. Now let's define a few key JTX terms. First, job type. This is the type of work that is being performed. You can think of it as the projects or products your company or organization creates or manages. As mentioned earlier, job types can be just about anything, such as data production and editing, creating cartographic products like a series of tax maps for county assessors' offices, or performing spatial data analyses. You can have multiple job types in your organization. To give a specific example of a job type, let's say that we are a natural resources GIS agency in West Virginia, and one of our duties is that we are responsible for mapping the location of wildlife conservation areas. We would create a job type called boundary mapping. Our next term is job. This refers to a specific unit of work which is associated with a designated area called the area of interest, an AOI. The term job answers the question, where is the work being done? In our West Virginia example, let's say we received some updates for one of the conservation areas in southern West Virginia, the Bluestone Wildlife Management Area. Our job type is still going to be boundary mapping, and our job is the area around the Bluestone, the location where the updates are needed. I should mention that for this particular example, we have just one job for our job type, but you can, and often will, have multiple jobs for your job types. It just depends on how the work is broken up or shared in your organization. The last term I want to define for you is the term user. These are the people assigned to do the work. In JTX, users are categorized into user groups based on their responsibility or their role in the organization. Are they a manager or a digitizing technician, for example? Throughout this presentation, we're going to use the following scenario. We're a government mapping agency in Washington, D.C. that has just been informed about construction for a new shopping center. With the shopping center, some new streets are going to be added to accommodate the traffic. So we need to update our street data layer to stay current with the construction. To review our JTX terms, the job type for our scenario is a transportation or a street update. We're going to call it street updates. We'll talk more throughout the presentation about how to create job types. But for now, I need to tell you that every job type has predefined steps that guide the completion of the work. Our job will be the areas around the shopping center where the new streets are being added. The users in our scenario agency are organized into 3 user groups: managers, digitizing technicians, and quality control technicians. Managers set up the jobs, technicians perform our updates, and our QC techs verify that the updates are correct. So let's go to our first software demonstration. In this demo, I'm going to introduce you to the JTX framework. With JTX, you not only get tools added to ArcMap and ArcCatalog, but you also get 2 new interfaces. The interfaces are the JTX Configuration Manager and the JTX application. The JTX Configuration Manager, which we're looking at now, is where you will go to customize JTX so that it is optimized to suit the needs of your organization. We'll talk about this interface in more detail in the last part of today's seminar. The JTX application is really the heart of JTX. I say that because this is the interface that your users will interact with on a daily basis. It's the gateway, if you will, to the tasks that the users need to complete in ArcMap and ArcCatalog. As a manager, you can use the JTX application to see what's being done throughout your organization. If, for example, I want to see what jobs have been created, I can click the All Jobs in my query list, and I see the jobs that I have created in my organization. Here I can see that one of my jobs is signed out to the QA/QC group, and I have another that's signed out to my technicians group. These jobs are waiting for people from those specific groups to take them and work on them. The last 3 jobs that I have are actually assigned to specific users. Now, if I click on or select one of my created jobs, I can actually get to the properties of the information that's being stored in JTX for that job. For example, I can tell that this Job 16 Demo 1 is created from a job type that is a street updates. It's listed here inside of the general box. I can also see that the start date for this job was February 23rd. The due date when this job should be completed is February 28th. I also see that this job in fact was started on February 23rd. If I scroll down, I can see a description of this job that tells me about what the work is being completed. Here I see that this is another street update, but it's for a new pharmacy that's being built over on 9th Street. Now if I want to see where the job location is, I can click the AOI tab. Okay. I'm going to get a base map that shows me general information about DC. This base map is configured in the Configuration Manager. I also see the actual area where 9th Street is located. If I want to see what's been done so far on this job, I can go to the Job History tab. This is going to tell me what's been done. I can see that the job has been worked on by just one user. It's myself. This is because this particular job was created for demo purposes. However, in a real-world scenario, you would actually have several different people that interact with a job at different times. Now, if I was a technician using JTX, I would be looking at this information to gain an understanding of what I'm going to be working on and what I need to do. As part of that investigation, I'd go to the Workflow tab. The workflow comes from the job type and tells me what needs to be done to complete the job. In the workflow of an active job, the yellow step, such as Edit Data, indicates the active step. If I go and click the Run button, it's going to execute my active step. Now what JTX is doing right now is it's opening ArcMap. It's setting up all the pre-configured properties for my job. It's loading my data, setting up my symbology, and it's going to zoom me into my area of interest for the job so that I can perform the needed edits. All of these settings are pre-configured for me based off of the job type in the Configuration Manager. Let me minimize ArcMap here so you can see the entire display. Now, as a technician, I have everything I need to do my edits. Have all my data layers. I'm zoomed to where I need to work. Really, all I have to do is start editing. And when I'm done, I simply save my edits and exit out of ArcMap. There are some tools on the JTX toolbar, which we see located here, that I can use to get information on my job while I'm in my ArcMap. For example, I can go to the Job Properties button and get a listing of all of the properties, same properties that we saw in the JTX application for this job. Or if I wanted, I could get the job history by toggling on the Job History button. As you can see, JTX's logged a record for when I actually executed the Edit Data step. We started this step at 3:15, and it was started by myself. I'm going to go ahead and close ArcMap now. And I'm not going to save any of the changes to the MXD that JTX created for me. I haven't made any changes, and the next time I execute the Edit Data step, I'll get the same exact setup for my MXD. When I exit out of ArcMap, I'm returned to the JTX application. Thus far, we've talked mainly about how an end user, such as a technician, would use this application. In the upcoming section, we're going to talk about how a manager is going to use the application to gather information that has been tracked for the job. In this section, we answered the overall question, what is job tracking? We also introduced you to a tool from ESRI called Job Tracking for ArcGIS, JTX, that helps to overcome the past challenges to tracking GIS jobs. We discussed the requirements for JTX, some key terminology, and a sample job that we will be revisiting throughout the rest of the seminar. In the software demo, you saw how JTX is truly integrated into ArcGIS. I'll now turn the seminar over to Malcolm, who's going to be answering some of your questions.
Thank you, Sandy. We got some really good questions coming in here. Start off with Alexis from Salt Lake City asked, do we need to know programming to configure and use JTX? No, you don't. JTX is a highly configurable tool just by using the applications that we provide for you, and Sandy will go into more detail in that later in this seminar. So you'll see that you can actually do a lot of things without actually doing any programming, but you can extend and add to the software by putting programming into your steps and automating some of your workflows for you. Ivy from Atlanta asks, after the AOI has been defined, can you redefine it at a later date? Yes, you can redefine the area of interest multiple times. If your area of interest happens to change throughout the job, you can just go in and remodify the area of interest, assuming that you have that user has the privilege to actually make that change. Eric from Minneapolis asks, can any statistical summary operations be performed on the jobs or users, such as how many total jobs pending? You can actually run reports on the tables on JTX using crystal reports. You can generate any kind of report you want from this information. It's all stored inside unversioned tables in the database. And then Mike from Nashville asks, must the features edited in a JTX workflow be stored in an ArcSDE geodatabase? No, they don't actually have to be in a geodatabase, but if you want to store log transactions, as you'll see Sandy show later on, you will need to actually have those features inside a version of ArcSDE geodatabase. But you can use JTX to help you work with jobs that aren't necessarily with ArcSDE. Sandy?
Thank you, Malcolm. Now let's talk about tracking jobs with JTX. Before we can track a job, the first thing we need to talk about is how jobs are created. The creation process is done in the JTX application. When creating a job, you first need to choose the job type. Once you've selected your job type, you need to decide how many jobs you want to create. Are you setting up work that is going to be conducted for just one location, a single job, or are you going to have several locations for the work that is being done? JTX gives you the ability to create multiple jobs at once. This is called batch job creation. Now the job, or jobs, will inherit some of its properties, such as the steps that need to be completed, from the job type. But there are some properties that you can set during the creation process so that they are customized for that particular job. You can specify the user that is going to be assigned to that job, or you can assign it out to a user group. This puts the job into a pool or a queue so that anyone in that user group can see it and choose to work on it. You can specify the time frame for the job. The time frame indicates the date by which the job needs to begin and end. You can also specify a priority level and provide a description for the job. The description is helpful in differentiating the different jobs. One property associated with the job is its workflow. This property is inherited from the job type, but it can't be modified during the job creation process. The workflow is a key part of a job, and I want to take a minute to talk about it and how it can be used for tracking the status of a job. In our scenario, our job type was street updates. You can see from the workflow here that the steps have been specified for that job type. When we create our job, these are the steps that become the workflow our users will follow to successfully complete the updates. Not only does the workflow specify what needs to be done, it also dictates the order for completion. From a manager's perspective, when you are viewing a job in the JTX application, you can use the workflow to assess the job status. The active step is colored yellow, and by looking at the active steps, you can see what has been done and what is yet left to do. It is important to realize that as your users are progressing through the workflow, JTX is documenting or logging any activity that has occurred on the job. You can see the log in the Job History tab of the JTX application. Everything throughout the life of the job is logged, starting from when the job was created and going up until the job is completed. The job being shown here is in the process of being edited. We know that because it's the last entry in the job history. Not only is the activity logged, but the time and date is recorded as well. For example, with this job, we see that it was created on the 9th by Sandy, myself, and after I did some updates to the properties of the job, I assigned it out to Malcolm, who'd started doing the edits on the job on the 11th at 9:08 in the morning. JTX also records what's called transaction feature history. This is a documentation of the edits that have been made to the data. Transactions can be defined as feature-level changes in the geodatabase. For example, if we modified a road and posted those changes, JTX would record a transaction indicating what the road looked like before and after the edit. With the transaction records, you can see when a new feature is added or how an existing feature was modified. Changes to both the geometry and the attributes are recorded. Geometry changes are recorded as changes in the shape and can be visually observed. Attribute changes can be seen by looking at a tabular report of the attributes before and after. Also, when a feature is deleted, a transaction is recorded. Transactions can be seen in ArcMap using the tools on the JTX toolbar, or you can export an XML file of the transactions using tools provided in the JTX Configuration Manager. Getting information from a job doesn't always come from tracking and monitoring the completion of steps. You may find that there is additional information that you need to record or have documented throughout the life of a job. The information I'm referring to is specific to the job as a whole, something that is not related to a particular step. This is done in JTX through the use of notes, attachments, and holds. Notes are sort of like postums. These are general text information that needs to be temporarily documented. In the JTX application, there is a Notes tab where you would read a note or post a note for the users. Notes can be changed at any time. Attachments are a little more formal type of communication. With attachments, you can share documents with your users. Some examples might be a Word document of instructions, maybe the proposal for doing the work, or a scanned map to use while digitizing. The Holds tab is used when you need to suspend work on a job for an indefinite amount of time. Examples of reasons to hold a job could be insufficient funding to complete the work, maybe technical problems or missing data, or possibly you've encountered a lack of resources and no one is available to currently work on the job. Another form of communication available in JTX is called notifications. With notifications, JTX is enabled to send messages via email after specified events. So as the manager, I might want to receive an email after the QC has been performed on the update, which indicates that all the work is complete for that job. Or you can set up JTX so that when you create new jobs and assign them out to specific people, those users receive an email telling them about the new job. Now let's go to our second software demonstration. In this demo, I want to give you a more in-depth look at tracking jobs using the JTX application. As we saw in the last demo, we currently have several jobs that are already created and active. But we're actually going to step through the process of creating a new job. To do this, I'm going to click on the Create Job button. My first decision that I have to make when I create this job is what job type am I going to be using. Our job that we're creating is going to be for our scenario that we've been chatting about, the street updates for the new shopping center. So I'm going to select street updates from the drop-down list of job types. Another thing I need to decide is how many jobs am I going to be creating. For this particular example, I'm only going to be creating one, so I'm going to leave my number here at 1. Now, as we've discussed, my job is going to inherit a lot of properties from the job type. Some of them I can modify here in the creation process so that they better describe what needs to be done for this particular area. So I'm going to click on the More button to do that. I can see that this job starts off with the job type being assigned out to the manager group, which means that someone from that group will need to take the job to do the first couple of steps. Since I'm a manager and I plan on doing those first few steps, I'm going to go ahead and assign the job out to me from the list of potential users. I'm also going to add some information to the job description. This description here is a generic one that's inherited from the job type, but I want to add on some information that helps me identify this particular job. So I'm going to add in, it's the street additions for the Belson Shopping Center. I also want to adjust the start and the stop dates. My start date is good, but I'm going to change the due date so that it corresponds to when the actual center is supposed to be completed. That date is on March 8th. All of my other properties are fine, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK to create my job. It's going to start me off on the Workflow tab, so if I wanted, I could actually get started working on this job. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Job Properties tab for just a minute. Here I can see the information that I just provided. I can see my start date and my due date, and I can see the description that I just added. I'm actually going to scroll up here, and I'm going to add a little bit more information to the job name. I'm just going to add in Belson Center to the name, and I'm going to go ahead and click Apply to enforce that change on the job. What that does is, I click the All Jobs query, I can now see Belson Center in the name of that job query list. Now let's go ahead and go to the Workflow tab and see what the first step for the workflow is. Define area of interest is the first step for this workflow. That means it wants me to create an area or an extent that's going to define where the work is going to be performed. So I'm going to go ahead and click the Run button to define that area of interest. I need to choose whether or not I'm going to define that area from a map or by using source extents. I'm going to go ahead and use a map. The base map that we see is actually configured in the Configuration Manager. It's set up to help make this particular step faster because the majority of the data that I need to find the job location is already available. However, if I do need more, I can click the Add Data button to add in more information. I happen to know that the job for the Belson Center is located just a little bit south of the bend here in the red line for the metro system, which is the DC subway system, if you will. So I've drawn in my box, and I'm going to go ahead and click Save to commit that area of interest to my job. When I click the Save button, I'm returned to the JTX application, and my workflow has progressed to the next step. I could at this point assign the job out to a technician and let them get started on doing the updates. But before I do that, I want to show you something that JTX has been doing for me behind the scenes. If I go to the Job History tab, I can see that for every action I took, a record has been made. For example, we started the creation process of this job at 3:29. We went to define the area of interest for this job at 3:31, and we finished defining the area of interest at 3:31:07. Now in the lecture, we also talked about notes, attachments, and holds. Well, let's say that we have plans for the construction. I can actually add that plan as an attachment so that my technicians can use it for reference while doing the updates. So I'm going to go ahead and click the Attachments tab. To add my attachment, I'm just going to click Add, and I have to decide whether or not I want to add it as a link or store it in the database. I'm going to add it as a link because all of my technicians have access to the network drive. That drive is in this demo data folder, and my plans are right here, this Belson Center Plans PDF. I'm going to go ahead and say Open, and those plans are now an attachment to my job. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to the Notes tab and add in a note for my users that lets them know that they need to use the attached plan as a guide while digitizing. If I click Apply, that's going to commit my note, and if I go back to the Job History tab, I see a new record for when I added that note. Now before we end this demo, I want to show you the Feature Transaction History tools. So I'm actually going to go to a job that I have open inside of JTX already. This job is also a Street Updates type job, and there have been some edits already performed and posted by our technician. And we're going to see what's been done. There are 3 tools that we can use to gather information about the transaction histories: the Load JTX Transactions layer, the JTX Transaction Inspector by Graphics, and the JTX Transaction Inspector. To see the transactions, I'm actually going to start with the Load JTX Transactions layer button. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be creating a new layer that gets added to my table of contents. So I need to give that layer a name. I'm going to call it Edits Job 5. I know it's Job 5 because that corresponds to the name of the job in the map document. For the query, I'm going to say that I want the transaction layer to show me all of the transactions where the job ID is equal to Job 5. When I say OK, I get that new layer added to my table of contents, and in my display area I have all features that were deleted shown in red, all new features that have been added shown in green, and all features that were modified shown in this blue color. Now if I wanted to see the information about the deleted feature, I would use the JTX Transaction Inspector by Graphics button, and I will click on the feature that I want to see the information for. I get an identifier or an inspector window that shows me the date that the feature was deleted and the transactions type it was in fact deleted. I can also see the attributes of that feature before it was deleted. Now if I wanted to get information about the feature that was modified, I could use the JTX Transaction Inspector. So I'll click on that button and I'll click on my modified feature. I get the same type of pop-up, and in this case I see that transaction date and type, and in the list here I can see that it was the street name attribute that was modified. It was M Street, and it's now been changed to South M Street. Transactions are a great way to document changes to the data. I'm going to go ahead and close the demo now and return to the slide presentation. Okay, before we go to the question and answer session, we're going to ask you a review question. You'll need to locate the review question link to participate in answering. Your question is, when creating a job, which of the following is not a property you will customize? The start time, the job type, the workflow, or the users? To submit your answer, go ahead and click A, B, C, or D, then click the Send button. In this section, we talked about the tools and information available for tracking jobs in JTX. We talked about how you would create a job, then the different ways that you can see what events have occurred for that job. We also talked about how you can set up JTX to send communication automatically after a step has been completed. In the demo, you saw how the JTX application can be used not only as a starting point for your users to do their work, but also as a tracking tool for the managers. I'll now turn the seminar over to Malcolm, who will answer some more of your questions.
Thank you, Sandy. Some more really good questions. Rudy from Olympia asked, does JTX create a separate map document or a collection of map documents for each job? Well, as you saw in the demo, when Sandy launched the edit data step, it actually created a JTX document, and that one document will be associated with the job for the life cycle of the job. If you want to store more than that, more documents than that, then you would have to use the attachments. Heather from Vienna asks, are there significant changes to JTX 3 from the existing JTX application? Yes, there are. From 2.1, there are some major improvements to the software. Just to point out a few things, obviously the workflow has changed a lot. Before, in the previous version, you could only have sequential workflows. Now you can have all sorts of complicated workflows. Attachments allow you to add files to the jobs. Queries are now completely configurable. You can add custom properties to your job if you have extra information you want to store along with the job. Job dependencies allow you to model relationship between jobs. And holds allow you to basically put a suspension on the job for an indefinite amount of time. So there are some major improvements, and that's just a few of them there. Ken from Salt Lake City asks, is there a limit on the number of users per job? There's only ever one user, a current user on the job at any one time, but you can set up ahead of time assignment of steps to certain users, and this means that when that step is reached, the user of the job is assigned to the user of the step. This allows you to basically auto-route the job to different people as the life cycle continues. William from Pittsburgh asks, can the job history be accidentally deleted or modified without job-related activities occurring? Actually, the only way to delete the job history is to actually delete the job itself. You can't delete individual pieces of history, so that would never happen. And the only people who are allowed to delete the jobs are those with certain privileges and the right software. And then finally, David from Wellington asks, is transaction history preserved after a post-reconcile compress process, or does it save the transaction history to XML first? Actually, you're right in your second point there, David. If you were to post and reconcile, or reconcile and post, actually the changes are logged at the post point, and they're stored as XML in an unversioned table. So that won't be a problem. If you were to compress after that, those things would still be there in the unversioned table. Sandy?
Great. Thank you, Malcolm. Now to revisit our review question, when creating a job, which of the following is not a property you will customize? The answer is actually C, workflow. And there was a tie of 48% between those who answered correctly at C and those who answered A. Start time is something that you can customize when you create the job. I, however, chose not to in my example. The workflow cannot be edited or changed during the actual creation process, but it's something that, if permitted, you can modify once the job has been created. For our final topic, we're going to discuss how you will create a workflow for your jobs. We learned in the last section that the workflow is a key component to a job. It provides a stable set of steps that define the operations that need to be completed. It tells the users what steps they need to do and the relative order that they should follow to complete them. Creating workflows are highly beneficial because they provide a stable set of steps for your user. This gives users a consistent experience, and they spend less time guessing about what needs to be done and more time actually doing the work. This pays off in an environment where often time is equal to money. In JTX, workflows are a property of a job type, so when you create a job, it's automatically inherited. In JTX, you would use the Configuration Manager to create your workflows. The Configuration Manager is the interface that allows you to customize JTX to fit your organization's needs. In addition to creating your workflows, you'll use the Configuration Manager to do things such as creating job types, specifying your users and your user groups. You can also manage user privileges, which specifies what a user can and cannot do in the JTX application. These are just a few examples of what you will use the Configuration Manager for. Now, before we can talk about creating job types and workflows, we need to talk about steps. Steps are important because they make up the workflow. A step is a task, one that executes some sort of action from either the software or the user. Before a step is included in the workflow, it is called a step type. There are several step types that come with JTX that you can use to build your workflow. You can also create your own step types if what you need to do is not readily available. To create a step type, you need to specify its properties. For example, here on the Profile tab for the Edit Data step type, we can see that the name of the step is Edit Data. And the description tells us that this step launches ArcMap with the data loaded for the job type. Another property of a step type is its execution. The execution specifies what happens when the step is run. There are three different types of executions. Procedural, which is a manual step with no automated execution, such as a step indicating that the user needs to update the documentation. Executable launches an executable or an exe file, such as ArcMap or possibly Microsoft Excel. A custom step object calls a customized program or DLL. one that you have created or one of the developer samples provided with JTX. Now that we know about step types, let's talk about how to create a workflow. Workflows, again, are a property of a job type. You will first create a job type or edit an existing job type. This is done on the Job Types tab shown here in the Configuration Manager. You'll click the Add button, then specify the properties for the job type to create a new one, or click the Edit button to edit an existing job type. Properties of the job type include its name and a description, some default information such as the start date and priority levels, maybe the layers you want to have loaded in ArcMap when it's launched through the JTX application, and the workflow for the job type. The Workflow tab is where you create the workflow for the job type. The canvas is very user-friendly. It's designed as a drag-and-drop environment. The left side of the canvas, you have the tree view of all of the available step types that you can include in your workflow. You'll start by selecting the step you want to add to the workflow, dragging it into the workflow canvas, then connecting the step to the workflow. The last thing you'll do is verify the workflow. This is going to check to make sure that the connections are appropriate. There are different types of workflows that you can build in JTX 3. This helps to make the workflow suit the needs of your organization. You can create sequential workflows where all steps are followed in a logical order from one step to the next without deviation. In the workflow listed here, the job starts with defining the area of interest, moves into inventorying the source, flows through the version creation, into editing and QCing the data. The final step is a notice that is sent to the manager that lets the manager know that the job is complete. You could also create a workflow that is conditional or branching. These workflows allow for the possibility that a task might not be required. If we look at the same workflow from the previous slide, we can create a branch off of the inventory source step. This particular branch allows the user to make a decision. If during the inventory process they find that there isn't any inventory to clip, then they can proceed down the workflow without clipping the imagery. Finally, you can create a looping workflow, where steps can be repeated if needed. In our example, the workflow can loop back from the QC to the editing if the QC technician identifies errors in the update that need to be corrected prior to finalizing the job. Now let's go to our third and final software demonstration. In this demo, we're going to investigate the JTX Configuration Manager. As mentioned, we use the Configuration Manager to customize JTX to suit the needs of our organization. Right now, we're looking at the users that have been granted access to JTX for these demos. If I go to the Step Types tab, I can see the steps that have already been created to use in my workflows. These are all steps that are available with JTX. If I select the Notify Step type and click on Edit, I can see the properties of the step type. I can see that the description of the step is it's a notification for when the job is completed. If I go to the Execution tab, I can see that this is a custom step object. It's one of the samples that comes in the JTX Developer Sample Kit. Now let's go take a look at the job types. There are two job types that have been created so far, land base edits and street updates. The street updates is the one we've been working with in our scenario. But let's say I want to create another job type. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and click Add, and I'm going to supply the properties of the job type. I'm going to keep with our construction scenario that we've been using, but since I already have a job type called Street Updates, I'm going to name this one Construction Updates. And for the description, I'm going to say that these are updates for the street layer to stay current with construction. Okay. Now I can actually go and set some of the default properties for my job type. These are the default properties that are going to be inherited for my job when it's created. So if I was to create a job with this job type, right now they would all have the start date of February 23rd. That's fine, I'll go ahead and leave that. I can change my due date to whatever it is I want the due date to be for all of my jobs of this job type. Versions are an important concept in SDE. A simple definition of a version is that they represent the master data set at different periods of time. I actually have a version that I'm going to use called the edit data version. All of the jobs that are created with this job type, I'm going to have listed as a high priority. They're important and we want them to be done quickly. Now for my assignment, I'm actually going to assign this out to a user group. I'm going to assign it to the manager group because the first couple of steps are, again, going to be something that I want my manager to do. Now let's go and customize or set up our workflow. As I mentioned in the slides, we have the steps over here on our left and our canvas on our right. We're going to set up just a very basic or simple workflow. So we're going to start by defining our area of interest. I'm just going to drag that to the canvas. Then we're going to edit our data. We're going to QC our data. And then we're going to send a notification to our manager that lets them know that all of the steps have been completed. Now for each of these steps, I can customize the properties. I do that by clicking on the Properties button and clicking on the step. For example, with this Define Area of Interest step, I can choose to have this done by a group or by a certain user. I'm going to go ahead and assign it out to the group. I can also specify whether or not this step is going to be run automatically or if it's something that can be skipped. I don't want this step to be skipped. For my workflow, it's a pretty important step, so I'm going to turn that option off. I do want to have this step be a self-checking step, however, which means once the execution is complete, the workflow knows that it can move on to the next step. I'm going to go ahead and say OK to these properties. Now ideally, you would go through and set the properties for all of these steps if you needed. Now that I have my properties set, I can use my connector button to connect from the defining of the area of interest to the editing of the data, from editing to QCing of the data, then from QCing of the data to notifying. If I click on the Verify Workflow button, it tells me that my workflow was successfully validated, which is always good. If I wanted to create a looping workflow like we saw in the slides, say going from the QC data to editing the data, I would use my connector tool and I would just draw in a connection going from QC to editing. Then I would modify the properties of that connection, and for the path name I would actually say corrections required. Click OK and I now have a loop in my workflow. I could at this point add more steps to the workflow, or I could configure more properties for this job type. As you can see, the Configuration Manager is your interface to customize JTX, and the workflow creation process is a user-friendly process. Let's go ahead and go back to our slides. In this final section, we talked about how you can create workflows for your organization. Workflows are created in the Configuration Manager as a property of a job type. We also talked about the step types that make up workflows and the different types of workflows you can create: sequential, branching or conditional, and looping. In the demo, you saw how we created the workflow for our sample job type, street updates. I'll turn the seminar over to Malcolm one more time so he can answer your questions.
Thank you, Sandy. Some good questions here. Diego from Walsenburg asks, how many steps can you assign per user? There's actually no limit on the number of steps you can assign. You can assign all the steps in one workflow to a particular individual if you wanted to, but that would kind of be a little pointless in terms of assigning steps. You'd want to assign them to different people, if at all. Otherwise, it just assumes that the next step is going to be performed by the current user. But there's no real limit based on that. Ivy from Atlanta asked, does JTX actually track hours spent on a job as for billing purposes? Well, if you look back at how Sandy was able to look at the job history, you'll be able to see the time and the user who created the job, and then if Sandy was to complete the job, then you'd also see that date of when the job was completed, to be able to see the difference in times there. It also stores a lot of other information about what happened throughout the life cycle of the job and when it happened and who it was performed by. Fletch from Tampa asks, can I create a report of deleted items at the end of the year and show them graphically? Yes, you can. Using the transaction loading tool that Sandy showed in ArcMap there, you can actually query by date and see, okay, which features were actually deleted between these two dates, and you'll actually be able to see them graphically on the map. You could also create a tabular report by running something like crystal reports on the transaction table. Cynthia from Fairborn asks, is there an ArcObjects interface for JTX? If so, does it prevent programmatically initiating a workflow when routine data is received? Yes, there is a set of objects, a set of business objects that JTX is built on top of. JTX applications are built on top of. So anything you've seen at Sandy do using the applications here can actually be reproduced using these business objects. As for initiating a workflow, you could pretty much do any of that via any kind of process you wanted. And finally, Eric from Minneapolis asks, if I already have an extensive SDE database set up with multiple versions and about 12 users, what would it take to implement JTX? Well, that's pretty much the perfect configuration there for JTX. You could just install the software on your client machines, deploy the JTX system tables in your SDE instance, and then all that would remain would be configuring the system to meet your own needs. So that sounds like a pretty good setup there. Sandy?
Thank you, Malcolm. It looks like we're just about out of time. A little bit more information for you. We do have some classes that you can take to help learn and better understand ArcSDE, both on the virtual campus and instructor-led training. These are important concepts for when you're actually going to be using and managing JTX. If you need JTX-specific training, you can contact Bruce Rowland at ESRI, and his email is listed here. We hope you enjoyed today's seminar, and on behalf of ESRI, I'd like to thank you all for attending.